Greetings from Georgia State University Center for International Business Education and Research, CIBER, in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm Lian Liu. We come to you on behalf of the Cyber Networks MSI Consortium that are sponsoring and organizing this webinar series. We've had about 70 webinars since we started in April 2020. We thank each and every one of you for joining us from several different time zones. We are really grateful that you choose to spend the hour with us. As a reminder, these webinars are being recorded. If you want to watch again or forward to others, you can find the recording of this one and previous sessions on our GSU-CIBER website or our YouTube channel. This webinar is led by the Institute of International Business and Cyber at University of Colorado, Denver. It is the first of a two-part webinar focusing on international entrepreneurship. This one will address the emerging topics and approaches in the international entrepreneurship research. Professor Nicole Coviello and Manuel Serapio, assisted by Dr. Pinar Bilk-Baljar and Karen Friedhag, will highlight the key trends, topics in international entrepreneurship research. They will also discuss implications for the field and including an extended Q&A session. So with that, I will pass the mic to Manuel.
Good morning. My name is Manuel Serapio, and I serve as faculty director of the Institute for International Business and Cyber at the University of Colorado, Denver, also associate professor of international business and entrepreneurship at our business school. I want to join Dr. Liu and our colleagues at GSU-CIBER in welcoming you to this international business pedagogy workshop focusing on international entrepreneurship research. Let me thank our friends at GSU-CIBER. Special thanks to Dr. Tamir Kavushgil, Dr. Liu, Paula Huntley, Michael Wallace, and Dr. Pinar Bilk-Baljar for hosting this. Also would like to acknowledge our team at the IIB Cyber at CU Denver, Karen Friedhoff, and Dr. Jingting Liu. Also would like to express our appreciation to the U.S. Department of Education, Center for International Business Education and Research, program, and the various cybers that are co-sponsoring these 70 plus, workshops. CU Denver has been a pioneer in offering this faculty development in international entrepreneurship. I would like to recognize Dr. Patricia McDougall-Covin, who helped start this program, and also invited Dr. Coviello to lead the research sessions after she retired. The program provides faculty and doctoral students an opportunity to learn more about best practices in teaching, research, and outreach in international entrepreneurship. Since we started the program 15 plus years ago, we've held this program in numerous locations, in Denver, in Atlanta, in Cleveland, in Honolulu, in Seoul, Manila, Bangalore, Copenhagen. And we are planning a program that Dr. Coviello will note later in Waterloo, Canada, in July. About 500 faculty members from 250 universities in 35 countries have participated in these IE workshops, and 100 more faculty members in the GSU-led Cyber IB pedagogy workshops. We're very thrilled and very honored that Dr. Coviello has agreed to lead the research sessions. Nicole, welcome. This is our inaugural session. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation and agreeing to lead the research session. We have shared with you the bio of Dr. Coviello. Most of you know her. She needs no introduction, but just a few words about her background. She holds the Lazaridis Chair of International Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. Her research intersects international business, marketing, and entrepreneurship. She is widely published, recognized in her field. Among others, she has been ranked in the top 1% of business and management scholars in the world, according to a study from Stanford University. She was also ranked 18th in the world for international business research, the only female in the top 20 list for that discipline. In 2018, an international study found Nicole to have 4 of the most influential publications in international marketing. We're looking forward, to your talk, this morning, Nicole. And again, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Manuel. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. As Manuel suggested, I am stepping into the very large shoes of actually quite a petite person, if you know Tricia McDougall. She asked me to join in with this, the Faculty Development and International Entrepreneurship workshops, and I was quite honored and privileged to do so. So thank you for joining us today. I've just been scanning through all of the participants that we've got, and I see old friends, I see co-authors, I see lots of new faces as well. So it'll be an interesting seminar. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research side of things, and then next week Manuel will be talking about the teaching of international entrepreneurship and how we can kind of approach best practices when it comes to the pedagogical side of what we do in the classroom. But in the meantime, what I'm going to do is share my screen, and as you've been advised, please enter any questions that you have in the Q&A, and those are being monitored, and then we can address those later. We've tried to set aside quite a lot of time towards the end. And just so you know, we actually have this booked from 11 until 12:30, so I know you're all in different time zones, ranging from Singapore to Shamin, you're in China, I think, although you never know where people are right now. It's an hour and a half. So if you can stay for the whole thing, that would be great. All right, so to get started, share. There we go. All right. Okay, so what I was kind of trying to figure out how to label this. Titles are one of the hardest things to do when you're writing a paper, and giving a presentation is actually no different, but I just came up with a boring one, which is doing research in international entrepreneurship. And one of the things, and in large part because of the very large group that we have here of people who are maybe newer to international entrepreneurship research, is that I have a number of things that I wanted to try and accomplish in this session. So a brief or potted history of the domain of international entrepreneurship research. And I wanted to do that in large part because to understand what we're doing from a scholarly perspective now, it's important to actually understand where that has all come from, because that informs a lot of our thinking. And rather than reinventing the wheel over and over, if we're actually building on what's been happening, then we are building a stronger field. So I'll talk a little bit about the history of the domain of IE. I'll highlight some of the catalytic research that really made a difference to get the field going, because this is quite a new field. I also wanted to flag some core papers that I think, if you're not familiar with them, they're useful to have, not for the purposes of a specific research question perhaps, but they are useful in terms of understanding how, again, the field has developed and some of the bigger frameworks that might inform your thinking, or at least have, at least in the past, they have informed our thinking and they could be useful going forward. I want obviously to talk about emerging research areas, and also I'm going to comment on things that I think are past their sell-by date, that as an editor, speaking for other editors that we're less perhaps interested in. And that relates to the last point, which is publishing in IE. Okay. So to start, in terms of the domain of study, we are working at an intersection. So with one parent being international business, the other parent being entrepreneurship, this is the baby field. But quite frankly, I think it's a bit more than that. I position it in this way because we work with and are informed by theories and data and results from both of these parent fields. I'm not saying that there are not other fields we learn from, because we absolutely do. I'm a person that comes from marketing, for example. And so my marketing lens informs my research. Some people will come from finance, from strategy, from innovation management, from knowledge management. And that informs the work that we do in either entrepreneurship or international business. And therefore, it informs what we do in international entrepreneurship. And even though this is a relatively young field, and I'm going to put its start date back until the late 1980s, it did not take long once international entrepreneurship was recognized as a track at the Academy of International Business. I think it took about 4 years, only 4 years, before that track was the biggest track at AIB. And that was kind of a waking up moment for example, the editors of Journal of International Business at that point in time. It was John Cantwell. And that's when they, GIBS appointed Becky Ruber as the editor for International Entrepreneurship. And I'm making this point because once we got going as a field, it gained a lot of traction. And for AIB to recognize, or at least acknowledge, that we were a very large track at the meetings, and then for GIBS to appoint an IE editor was pretty important for us. And I think it gives the field a lot of credibility. We have these two parental influences, and I just want to take you back to look forward a little bit. I'll do that a couple of times in the session. In international business, scholars have been studying small firm internationalization for a long, long time. I will tell you now that I'm born in 1962, so this even predates me. 1960 to 1979, we actually see old studies on specifically small firm internationalization from Penny, from Bernie Wolf, Idle and Ziff in the Journal of Marketing. So it's not that this is a new phenomenon, because it was capturing some interest in the 1960s and 70s. And then through into the 80s, we started to see Carsters and Welsh, Stephen Young, more from Laurie Welsh. Jonathan Kaloff did a PhD on small firm internationalization, or considering size as it relates to internationalization. He did that here in Canada with Paul Beamish at Ivy. And these were some of the early, but I'm going to say this is a long history, but it's a light history of research on SMEs or small firm exporting. And that's because the focus was really on the size of the firm rather than age, and I'm going to come to that later. And the interest was purely in exports. And so it's gone back for some time, and we draw on these papers, but things shifted, and that's what the arrow is meant to indicate. In 1990, and I really don't know how this happened, but it happened. Jim Bell was at Ulster, and Sharon Lone is in the audience. So hi, Sharon. She worked very closely with the late, great Jim Bell. Jim and I both started our PhDs separately. We didn't know each other. We were looking at internationalization of young technology firms, and we were actually from two sides of the world coming up with similar phenomena. We're seeing similar things happening in our data. And this was a bit of a complement to what Jonathan was doing with his PhD, although he was really focused on trying to understand how internationalization changed by firm size. We were interested in the younger firms, and age is different than size. We'll come back to that. In 1993, Tamer, who is at GSU, was in Australia on sabbatical, and he happened to attend a McKinsey consulting presentation where a chap by the name of Michael Rennie first used the term born global. And Tamer thought that was a really wonderful concept. He wrote a piece on it for the ABI Inform, a magazine, or the publication that's put out by AIB. And he talked to Gary Knight, who was his doctoral student back in Michigan State, and said this would be a great idea for your dissertation. So we start to see that there's a shift from classic international business scholars looking at, what's happening with small firms, to two people living in very small countries on opposite ends of the world, looking at what's happening with firms in their economies and realizing that something else is going on than we've normally looked at in small firm internationalization. And at the same time, Tamer was in Australia, another small economy, and Australians were beginning to talk about this concept. So that's from the IB side of things. You can see an evolution. From the entrepreneurship side of things, in 1989, Tricia McDougall, as part of her PhD work, defined international entrepreneurship, kind of out of the blue from an entrepreneurship perspective. And she defined it as the development of international new ventures or startups that from their inception engage in international business, thus viewing their operating domain as international from the initial stages of the firm's operation. So when this definition came out, it was focusing on the new ventures or startups, the younger firms, that from the very beginning were considering the international market as their domain. That's where they were operating. And that's important to keep in mind. It's not that they were pulled into international markets or happened to go into international markets later, but they were founded with the intent to internationalize. That's an 1989 definition. So just think about the parallels and the timing here relative to the last slide. In 1990, Ben Oviatt joined Georgia State, and Tricia and Ben attended Babson. Now, if you don't know, Babson is the primary entrepreneurship conference for entrepreneurship scholars in the world. I think the two big conferences would be Babson and going to the Academy of Management meetings. But Babson is really just all about entrepreneurship. And they went to Babson and they met a chap named Peter Sprague, who was speaking at a panel. At the time, he was the chairman of the National Semiconductor Systems, and he was also CEO of a startup called Wave Systems. And he said, global startups are the wave of the future. And both Tricia and Ben were coming at things from a strategy perspective, and they found that what they were seeing in terms of phenomena, particularly Tricia, based on her PhD research, and then comments like this made them really think that there was something that needed to be studied. In 1992, I happened to meet Tricia and Ben at a conference. The Babson conference happened to be held in INSEAD in France. And Tricia and Ben were in my presentation, and I was presenting my PhD work. So I started my PhD in 1990, and this was about, I had my data and I was writing it up. And we realized that we were studying the same phenomenon from different angles. So I was coming at it from a marketing and IB lens, and they were coming at it from strategy lens. And Tricia and Ben were beginning to write what would ultimately become their Journal of Business Venturing 1994 publication. And they asked for my cases. And I gave them to them because I had these 4 unique cases that were, at least from my perspective and in New Zealand, and then kind of classic stage models of internationalization. I actually call them deviants because they weren't behaving like they should according to the, for example, stage models of internationalization. And all of that came together. Those 4 cases came together with the other, I think, 20 cases that they pulled together from different sources. And that's the basis for their JBV paper with Scott Shane. So you can see that there is kind of a somewhat parallel evolution between the two fields through the same windows of time, getting into the early 1990s when people were beginning to see things were happening that didn't quite fit with what we'd been taught in international business or entrepreneurship for that matter. But we had a bit of a problem because mainstream IB scholars were and still are pretty stuck on MNE internationalization, so the multinational enterprise, or SME internationalization. And they're again focusing on size issues, so how big a firm is, as opposed to how young a firm is, or how old a firm is. And there's different implications by size and age in terms of the resources that are available and so on. In entrepreneurship, they looked at the IE stuff that was emerging, and they weren't really sure if internationalization was entrepreneurship because wasn't there a whole field of international business? So both of the so-called parent disciplines were kind of like, not sure about this emerging field, and lots and lots and lots of papers got rejected. And it was, you know, as it always is with something that's new, you kind of have to work on things. And I think that's where Ben and Tricia were really quite catalytic in terms of attending conferences I personally am not a big conference attender anymore. I was in my early days, but they were very good at making sure that they were visible, present, and talking to people to educate them about this field. And in 1994, 3 catalytic papers came out. The first one was truly influential. They're all influential because they're catalytic, but the first one is from Richard Wright and David Ricks, and they wrote from the editors in GIBS. Actually, was it from the editors? I'm not sure, but they're both senior colleagues and scholars in international business. Very mainstream, you would say. Both had been editors of GIBS, and they highlighted IE as an emerging theme. So that signal of legitimacy from Richard and David was pretty important, reaching out to the wider academy to say, this is something we need to be paying attention to. And then Tricia and Ben had I don't want to say a 2-hit wonder, because that sounds a little derivative, but they had 2 really important papers that were published, both in 1994. The first is where they define international new ventures in GIBS, and the second is where they distinguish international new venture behavior from mainstream IB theory, and that's the JBV paper. So what they've effectively done in 1994 is that they publish in the top international business journal and the top entrepreneurship journal, and that combined with Wright and Ricks sets the scene for the potential of international entrepreneurship research. And I have to say, after that was a real flurry of papers. And it was really, in hindsight, it's quite exciting to watch, but it was also exciting to live it at that point in time. So in 1995, Jim Bell and I each published our papers coming out of our dissertation, and we both were looking at early and fast internationalization by young firms. And evidently, Jim was in Ireland talking to his colleagues saying, who is this person in New Zealand? And I was in New Zealand saying, who is this person in Ireland? Because we were talking about the same thing. So that was kind of fun. In 1996, the first paper on foreign globals came out, and that was from Gary Knight out of his dissertation work with Tamer, and the advances in international marketing. So it was kind of an unusual publication place, but this is a highly cited paper, and it's the first one that really talks about this concept of foreign globals, which again, something I'll come back to later. In 1997, International Business Review published some of my PhD work on networks as it relates to young firm internationalization. And Tai Koed Madsen and Per Survey, coming out of Denmark, talked about foreign globals. And those two papers in the International Business Review, which is the journal for the European Academy of International Business, I think are still 2 of the most cited papers in IBR. 1997, Becky Ruber and Eileen Fisher started a discussion around the international experience of the top management team, that's TMT. That was a GIBS publication. In Journal of Marketing, Marion Jones in 1999 identified through her PhD research 4 different patterns of internationalization events over 25 years of time, and she signaled out the international entrepreneurs as part of that. And then in 2000, we had 2 big papers, Zara Ireland and HIT. So Shakir Zara's paper in 2000, that actually won the Best Paper Award for the Academy of Management Journal, which is a very, very big recognition. And they were the first really large-scale empirical study that was looking at multiple factors influencing the outcomes for young technology firms. And then Autio, Sapienza, and Almeida, they studied and opened up a discussion around learning advantages of newness in 2000. So all of this, as you can see, is happening in basically 4 or 5 years. And there's obviously other papers as well, but this is a kind of a potted history of how many papers started to kind of hit, and in good journals. And we also see some interesting patterns in these journals. Yes, we've got GIBS and AMJ, but we also have European Journal of Marketing, Journal of International Marketing, so signaling an interest from marketing scholars, and also International Business Review, which is bringing in the European side of things, because in those days, there was actually kind of a European, and there is to some extent now, a European way of doing things and a North American/American way of doing things. So these are, in my mind, quite catalytic. People go back to these papers now to kind of revisit some of the early arguments. But these are the ones that have really changed the potential for international entrepreneurship research. And just some quick observation. I find it really interesting that the earliest studies are pretty much by junior faculty and doctoral students. And we would go to senior scholars for advice on certain things, but it was, I mean, Tricia, Ben, me, Jim, Marion, Gary, we were all, you know, in this group here. Ben was faculty, and I think by then Tricia might have been faculty as well, but we were really young. And I guess because we were, and I'll say young and new to the field, you don't have a lot of fear when you're new to the field, and that's a huge asset. The more I know, the more cautious I get, and that's not always so helpful. So it's the fresh ideas that come from new scholars, and one of them is in the audience today, and I'm going to come back to him later, is my colleague Yanto Chandra, who I wrote a paper with, and he had some groundbreaking ideas in about 2008, 9, and 10, and they're now going to make a big difference. But he was that kind of an early thinker, and that's what I encourage junior scholars to be. Focus was on new and young firms that did not fit traditional stage models of internationalization. Now, of course, there's other ways to view internationalization, looking at the ILO models and looking at foreign direct investment, transaction costs, all that kind of stuff. And they also don't fit very well there. But the big barrier that we were seeing is that the stage models that were typically taught in the classroom were not being seen in what these young firms were doing all over the world. What we were seeing was a phenomenon, and we were looking at industry and talking to industry and listening to industry. And rather than, and I'll be quite frank here, looking for a theoretical gap, and I say that with a little bit of cynicism because I'm increasingly cynical about the theory side of things. I agree that we need to work with theory and develop theory, but there's some very important things that really need to be addressed because they're important phenomena. And that's what happened with international entrepreneurship. We had an emphasis in those early days on tech-intensive firms. I think almost all of us were looking at that type of organization, and that's just a reflection of, at that point in time, I mean, we think things move fast now. At that point, we were kind of racing hard to catch up with all of the changing technology, and that's before firms could be digital. So everything was basically easier, faster, and cheaper with new technology. And I have to say, in those days, that for me, a new technology was a fax machine. So put that into perspective. And also something from an observational point of view is that a lot of us were coming from, not always, but coming from small domestic economies. So little countries who didn't have much choice but to go elsewhere in order to have a, to grow their organization. So I was in New Zealand. Jim studied Denmark and Northern Ireland. Per and Tai were in Denmark. A lot of research was in Finland and so on. Scotland, Marion was there. Shamin was there doing his PhD and so on. So let's talk a little bit about the core papers. And these are just to signal some of the, I think, the bigger frameworks that you might find useful to just know so that you have them to draw on. The first is the GIFs paper by Tricia and Ben in 1994. This is where they, as I said earlier, they define international new ventures. And that is a business organization that from inception seeks to, has the intent to derive significant competitive advantage from the use of resources and sale of output in multiple countries. So here, there is no discussion about how many countries and how far away they have to be. And there isn't really even an explicit issue around timing, but the intent message is here, is that they, from inception, their goal is to be serving international markets somehow, some way, or working with customers and suppliers in international markets. And importantly, and I really want to flag this, there were 4 different types of international new venture in the GIB 1994 paper. And this is from that paper. Running along this axis, we're looking at value chain activities and the extent to which few activities are coordinated or lots of different activities are coordinated. And here, running along the horizontal, looking at the number of countries that are involved. We have few, serving very few countries, or serving many countries. So it's a simple 2 by 2. As always, you know, having a solid line in between is always a little bit dubious, but we'll use that for these purposes. So a very simple international exporter / importer is one that serves very few countries, maybe 1 or 2, and not requiring too much in the way of value chain coordination. And just as an aside, I want to tell you that in 1977, there was an exporting paper done in the US, and the details are actually just falling out of my head right now, but what sticks with me is that they were Wisconsin exporters selling to other parts of the US. So that's an interesting view of what export is, selling from within the US to another part of the US. But that's the way our view of exporting and internationalization has changed over time, because exporting is just also one type of internationalization. And that's typically what we would see with this type of organization here. A multinational trader is, again, working with simple logistics when it comes to the value chain, but is serving many countries. Here is where we start to see more of something that fits with kind of our current view of international new ventures, or maybe not our current view, but where most of the research sits. We either have a global startup, which is many value chain activities being coordinated, so fairly complex operations serving many countries, and the geographically focused startup, which is, again, serving or dealing with many value chain activities, but there's relatively few countries involved. I'm going to come back to that distinction, but what we've got here is essentially global versus geographic. And some would argue, and in fact, a number of years ago, I used to compare the born global to the global startup, and I was actually wrong in doing that. And the reason for that is that what is emphasized in Oviatt and McDougall's work is the issue of the coordination of value chain activities. This is not just about exporting. This is about all the potential value chain activities that could be involved. So keep that in mind. And also that there are 4 different types of INV as laid out by this particular model. Tricia and Ben then wrote a paper in Academy of Management Journal for a special issue on international entrepreneurship. This came out in 2000, and they widened the scope of international entrepreneurship, moving it beyond the 1989 definition from Journal of Business Venturing. And they formally position it at the intersection of research in IB and entrepreneurship. So this intersection issue where we've got 2 parents informing a third discipline. So their definition of IE is a combination of innovative, proactive, and risk-seeking behavior that crosses national borders and is intended to create value in organizations. And you can see the explicit effort to integrate entrepreneurship and international business here. So if we think about the definition of a firm as entrepreneurially oriented, they are innovative, proactive, and risk-seeking. So they pretty much pulled that from the EO side of things, the entrepreneurial orientation side of things. And the IB side of things comes from crossing national borders. And then from a strategy perspective, which is their actual home, was intended to create value in organization. Importantly, they went one step further and said, IE research is research on this behavior plus research comparing domestic entrepreneurial behavior in many countries. So if I use EO as an example, it would be comparing EO in Canada and, let me say, Chile and China, for sake of 3 culturally distinct kinds of cultures. Comparing what firms are doing across countries rather than just looking at what a firm might be doing within a country. And effectively, this definition is the one we've been using for some time now, and it sets the parameters for research. So now that I think about it, it's 22 years of using this definition of IE. So from there, we have a few models that I just wanted to quickly run through for you. One is by Shaker Zara and Jerry George, and Jerry was Shaker's student, and of course he's gone on to be an immensely impactful and well-known scholar. Both of them are. And their initial model went into a book chapter by Hill, Ireland, Camp, and Sexton. It probably hasn't gotten the attention that it deserved, but it was and remains useful. So they look, first of all, at organizational factors, such as the characteristics of the top management team and then characteristics of the firm, how that relates to what they call the dimensions of international entrepreneurship. And that refers to the extent or the intensity of international operations, the speed of international expansion, and the scope of international expansion. And then they link that to competitive advantage in terms of both financial and non-financial outcomes. They also highlight potential moderating factors, being the environment, so everything outside, ranging from competitive forces and growth opportunities to culture and institutional environment, to what's happening with the industry and the potential for economies of scale. And from the strategy side of things, they're looking at the strategic capabilities, competencies was the word that they used in 2002, to identify from an internal strategy perspective what might moderate the relationship between these characteristics and international entrepreneurship dimensions. What was notable about this particular figure is we'd been talking about this stuff. We were beginning to talk about these things. We were beginning to unpack what this meant, but they added in strategy and the issue of competitive advantage. So their model was not only an integrated model, but kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit so that we weren't just looking at the firm and how fast they went or how quickly they went international, for instance. That was followed by a paper I did with Marion Jones. I don't think Marion is with us today, but she's probably one of the best minds in international entrepreneurship. Recently retired, which is sad, and we've written 3 papers together, and this was almost but not quite the biggest and the ugliest. This is a model where we try to conceptualize things as an entrepreneurial internationalization behavior. So internationalization that is entrepreneurial. And I know many of you will have seen this, but if you haven't, just to kind of explain a few things. We've tried to account for a lot of ideas. This is a general model, and the paper then goes on to talk about more specific models that can be broken out to be used for research purposes, because studying all of this at one time is really a very complicated thing to kind of consider. So over here on the left, we incorporated psychic distance. We also looked at when in time things happened. And that's because, as noted fairly recently by Mikael Hilmarsson and Martin Johansson, is that what happened in the 1980s versus the early 2000s versus 2020, 21, and 22 with COVID, those kinds of episodes and what happens in time does make a difference. And we have to account for that. We also include reference time, and that's to understand from, for example, from the time a firm is formed until the first, and I'm popping up here to this M, this first internationalization event, how long does it occur? So we have a short one, we have a long one, we have a medium length one. Understanding those things is also important in terms of time. I think probably what differentiates this model from for example, Zara and George, is that we talk about firms having an international fingerprint. and a profile. And the point being is that in the same way that you and I all have unique identifiers in the form of our fingerprints, so do firms. So a prescriptive model across firms is really inappropriate because every firm has its own fingerprint as a reflection of all of these factors. So we wanted to build that argument in. And the other was building in a cyclical effect so that time was accounted for, as was feedback. And that's where this infinity loop comes into play, is that what happens in terms of firm performance goes back and feeds into all of these other phases as well. And what happens with internationalization behavior, sometimes people position as feeding forward into performance, but your decisions and your actions here will also have an influence, for example, on what's happening in the industry and the market. So this is meant to be a general model that has various components that you can pull on. And the issue of speed. So we've heard a little bit about time and timing. Tricia and Ben wrote again a paper in 2005 in Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice. And they highlight the issue of internationalization speed. And others have done this, tried to break out what it means in different ways. Shamin Prashantham is in the audience. He would be one of those people that have tried to do that. Francisco Acero, Jose Casillas, people in Spain, and lots are trying to now disentangle the various components of speed. But what this model was trying to do was saying, if you're presented with some sort of an opportunity, that will have an impact on how quickly you enter your first market, how quickly your scope expands, and how quickly your international intensity or your commitment increases. That relationship between entrepreneurial opportunity and internationalization speed will be mediated by the decision maker and the perceptions of who's ever making those decisions. And I love this model for the simple fact that it says it's not a firm making the decisions, it's people making decisions. And that's what's recognized here. Those decisions are going to be enabled by technology changes and motivated by what's happening in the competitive space, moderated by knowledge they have about the foreign market and the nature of the firm in terms of its knowledge intensity. And another thing that I have historically loved is recognition of the role of network relationships, because by the time 2005 came around, we had pretty good understanding that for young firms, it was network ties that was facilitating their rapid growth into international markets. And those papers kind of led us to a paper with Marion Jones, and her doctoral student at the time, Yiquan Tang. And we did a review of the IE field. And this is something I will never, ever, ever do again, because it was the hardest piece of work I think I've ever had to do. At that time, we reviewed and read and reviewed over 600 papers to identify 323 papers in IE, and that was until the end of 2009. As of the end of last year, I've counted, fitting within this set of parameters, about 1,100 papers in IE, and I think they could all probably be pattern matched onto this ontology, and with maybe some changes. But going through this review process was hugely informative, but also a very long and tedious process. Hard work, hard work. But what we identify are three different types of, and it was interesting because we understood, obviously, the McDougall and Oviatt definition of what IE was from 2000, but we wanted to see what the data said. And the data told us there were actually three different types of IE research. On the left here, category A, that is research that focuses on entrepreneurial internationalization, i.e. firms going abroad. Type B over here, that is the research comparing entrepreneurship across different countries. And type C was actually a combination of the two. And so the biggest pool of research by far is over here on the left, entrepreneurial internationalization, followed by the cross-country research, and least common at the time was type C. What hopefully is helpful about this paper is that in addition to the ontology, so you can identify, for example, if I look over here, I say, okay, 54 papers, 96 papers, 23 papers. Ooh, okay, here's 15 papers only looking at entrepreneurship issues as they relate to internationalization. And entrepreneurship here is distinct from social capital or networks or comparing different patterns of internationalization. I think, oh, there's an opportunity for research maybe. And also in this paper, we break down each of those thematic areas to identify when papers were started, and you can also get access to all of the authors as well. And these this is one of the early review papers, and it was meant to set a scene for, you know, something that would be updated now, and people have tried to update. But as the field gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it's harder to do a full-scale review of the field, and more typically now we see topic-specific reviews. Okay, so I talk a little bit about the parameters of IE research. This comes from, it's printed in a 2016 book chapter written by myself and Marion and Tricia. And we include, for international entrepreneurship, research that directly and explicitly integrates theory and concepts from both IB and E in one of the three categories of entrepreneurial behavior across borders, or comparisons across different countries, or institutional contexts, or a combination of A and B. And I'm going to flag something now. I'm going to flag the exclusions, and then we may come back to that based on your questions. The exclusion criteria by theoretical relevance are firms or studies focused on SMEs rather than IE per se. And what I mean by that is that they're basically studying what small firms do without bringing in entrepreneurship theory and being informed by entrepreneurship research. And a small firm, and I make this point because a small firm is not necessarily an entrepreneurial firm. In the same way that an entrepreneurial firm can be a small firm or a large firm. So focusing on just small firm internationalization was, according to the three of us, really not sufficient in terms of it being belonging to IE research. There's also research out there that's interesting and might be informative, but it's not really IE per se. So there was research coming out of Sweden, for example, looking at biotech firms and global industries. And that's really about biotech and the tech innovation. It's not so much about what the firm is doing to internationalize or their entrepreneurial processes associated with. Because of category B from our earlier work, studies that focus on domestic entrepreneurship in one country, those are not considered international entrepreneurship. Similarly, cross-cultural assessments of new measures. Gary Knight wrote a very interesting paper where he did a cross-cultural assessment of entrepreneurial orientation. And interestingly, he did it in Canada with English and French-speaking Canadians, if I've got that right. Definitely there was French-speaking Canadians. And I thought, how international are they? But they are. That, however, doesn't fit within IE as a IE piece of research. And same with research on transnational and immigrant entrepreneurship. And that's probably going to raise the most questions, so I will come back to that. It's one of my last discussion points. So when we think about what IE research is, this is, I think, still the generally accepted view. And in 2016, this is what we'd identified as being not really in the field of IE. Not to say that we were right or fully accurate, but that's where we stood at the time. So let's look at what's emerging. IE research is open to lots of different topics and theoretical foundations and methods, which makes it really cool. From IEscholars.net, there's ongoing work in some traditional fields of IE. There's still network research, capabilities, strategic posture like entrepreneurial orientation, knowledge, research on the demographics of the founders and so on. There's lots of review papers. This is a field that has seen more review papers than I think any other, too many actually. And there's increased recognition of context. This, I think, is important. So we're actually really trying to understand and incorporate institutional theory and understand institutional influences. And also related to that is the context of emerging economies. And I'm going to use this little symbol to highlight when I think things are important. And what I think is important also to note here, it's not just about studying entrepreneurial internationalization in an emerging economy, I think what's informative there is to understand how and why that emerging economy and the behavior of its firms, in particular its behavior of its firms and the managers that drive those firms, how is it and why is it similar or different to what we see in other kinds of economies. So it's a comparison is quite useful. We've seen increased emphasis on research about the people side of things that goes well beyond demographics. So emotional intelligence, their behavioral competencies, their socio-economic, emotional goals, personal goal orientations. I think Anne Domerath is in the audience. Anne has a paper on this with me, where we're actually digging into something that is, I think, more meaningful than simple demographics. And that is trying to understand why people think the way they do and why that and how that influences their decision making. And of course, that's the entrepreneurship side of research coming into IB. That's important. Post-entry patterns, processes, and speed. The patterns and processes have always been important, but there is a particular interest now in post-entry. It's not everything up to a time of international entry, but afterwards, and speed, and unpacking speed so that it's not just about how quickly you go into international markets, but it could also have to do with the pace of ongoing internationalization or the rhythm, how it changes over time with ongoing internationalization, or the end of international, sort of reverting, pulling out of international markets, re-entering, and so on, and how quickly. From, I guess I'm sitting here in Waterloo, which is a very tech-centric type of town. IE researchers have signaled a clear recognition of the technological shift that is happening. These are, I think this is 7 papers. They came out in 2020, I think, just in IE. Internationalization of apps, international digital competence, digital international entrepreneurial experience, influence of value chain digitalization, and so on. So this is a hot area, and the issue of additive manufacturing. So it's not just about digital, but we're talking about 3D. So somebody leading work in that area is Martin Hannibal in Denmark. So that's a very important area for research and something that we see a lot of coming through in submissions. So this is where I'm going to go a little bit back to the future, and I want to pick up on a paper that Yanto Chandra and I wrote in 2010, and it picks up on this digital space, just as an example of what I'm talking about. This is in JWB, and this was triggered in part by Yanto's PhD, where I wrote, I think I was his external examiner, and I think my decision letter was, I don't know, like 10 pages long. And I got some comment back from his advisor saying he'd never seen somebody write 10 pages and then say, pass with no problems. But it was a beautiful PhD. And all of the comments were actually meant to help Yanto publish. And then he asked me to join him on this. And these are his ideas. But I think we need to pay attention to them. So what our argument was that in international business research, we have research on international ventures, and we have research on multinational corporations. And then from a marketing side of things, and I'm going to say a marketing side of things, we don't have just firms that are doing business now. There are also individuals that are doing business or have the potential to do business. One group is unlikely to participate in international entrepreneurship. They are the more conventional consumers who are buying from firm type 2 and firm type 1. And the other is the new entrepreneurial consumer. And this person or group of persons, networks of consumers, they come together and they identify and exploit opportunities to internationalize, essentially. And to make that clear, we built a 2x2, and we were very much influenced by Oviatt McDougall's work. And we identify 4 different kinds of consumers as international entrepreneurs, meaning people like you and me who are now moving into the international entrepreneurship space. And this was back in 2010. So the first group down here are international traders. And that's when people are selling internationally through eBay, through Etsy, through Bonanza. They may be setting up their own international shop with Shopify or Equid. I'm not even sure if I'm saying that correctly. But this gives people the opportunity to internationalize by selling their own things. It could be old clothing, it could be their art, it could be vintage jewelry, but they're selling all over the world. Another group are the ones who are outsourcing their expertise and talent through organizations like Upwork and Fiverr and freelancer.com, freelancing organizations, but you could be sitting in Chicago and serving customers in Shanghai who are benefiting through your work that's been implemented and you're outsourcing through, for example, Fiverr. Over here, consumers as international financiers, and that's the P2P lending side of things. Prosper and Lending Club are examples of people like you and me who were able to invest in and support development of organizations around the world through new technologies. New technologies obviously are enabling all of this. And then finally, those of us who, not say those of us, the people out there who are both innovators and producers who are brainstorming ideas and fixing problems and creating new products and technologies through organizations like Incentive and Hive and Xerox, pardon me. Xerox, that's a bit old dated. So these are 4 different types of consumers as international entrepreneurs. But after our paper on this, and I remember thinking, a reviewer at the time said, this should be a game changer for the field. And I thought, that would be cool, but it really hasn't been. And I think it hasn't been because we haven't had necessarily a widespread understanding of the role of technology and how it facilitates everything that we do. And now in 2010, we didn't have all that many fully digital business models. And these examples here have all been updated from what we were working with in 2010. The fact that we are all living in an age of technology and wired to our phones and apps out the ears, et cetera, means that these roles for consumers as international entrepreneurs, I think there's a huge opportunity for doing research. So please take this model and run with it. And I think this is where, when it comes to the digital side of things, it's important to really appreciate a digital business model. So I want to go back to an earlier point I made about being born with the intent to serve foreign markets quickly, or the firms that happen to internationalize early and or quickly. These are really different things because the managers are thinking really differently. So I made a point in 2015 in a critique of Knight and Cavaskill that they studied these firms, whereas if you're studying international, truly international new ventures, that's what these are all about. Over here, we have this new type of organization, one that's fully digitalized, and they don't need a lot of employees. They don't need a lot of physical space. And there's a paper that with Sinead Monahan and Esther Titman came out in GIBS 2020, and we're trying to identify research opportunities for these kinds of firms. And just as a point of clarification, if you've ever used Duolingo, it's a fully digitalized firm that was born with the intent to be international fast, instantaneously, essentially. Shopify, if you know Shopify, here in Waterloo and Ottawa, this is a firm that is an accidental internationalist, if we use Hennert's terminology. In 2004, they went international by pressing a button when they launched. They didn't actually proactively think about international strategy until 2018. But this is a huge unicorn for the Canadian technology sector. They're the biggest player in their space in the world. And their VP of revenue generation at that point in time said, yeah, we didn't really start thinking about what we were doing internationally until just a couple of years ago, which was kind of interesting. And it makes me think, okay, what's going on here versus here? Again, research opportunities. Some of you might be wondering about international social entrepreneurship. And I think we see it in IE, but I think it really has an identifiable home in entrepreneurship, particularly the social entrepreneurship side of things. And then there's, of course, diaspora entrepreneurship, and research on returnee entrepreneurs, immigrant, refugee entrepreneurs, or entrepreneurs in crisis. And there's actually two established homes for this. One is the transnational entrepreneurship literature, and the other one is mainstream entrepreneurship. And Dean Shepard is doing a lot of work in this area. And the transnational entrepreneurship field focuses on entrepreneurs embedded in essentially their home country and their host country. So their old country and their new country, and they're trying to either make a go in both markets, or they're managing their cultural norms in a new market relative to an old market, etc. And a classic work here is from Drory, Honig, and Wright. These, for me, fit in international entrepreneurship if the research also sits in one of the three categories I talked about earlier. So if it's returning entrepreneurs internationalizing, or if it's a comparison of immigrant entrepreneurs across different either cultural or institutional environments. If they don't do that, for example, it's just what returnee entrepreneurs are doing in Pakistan, for example, that's not really international entrepreneurship. So, at least in my opinion, and other editors might disagree. So it's always worth, being aware of that. But just something to keep in mind about how you position your work. And finally, remember the domain of study. So don't forget entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship research is doing some very exciting things, particularly around understanding the team and not just the founder. And I think that can come into IE. They are developing, and much better at developing, new skills than we are in international business, than international business scholars are. So they have really nice measures that are coming through around things like fear of failure and in evaluating opportunities. These are some of the new things that they're looking at. Entrepreneurial identity, more than their psychographic and demographic profiles. Failure, passion is a hot area in entrepreneurship research. And I think they're more creative when it comes to methods. So we are a little bit mainstream, lots of cases, lots of surveys, lots of secondary data that really is not a good fit for the research question, but it's available. Whereas the entrepreneurship researchers, they have very sophisticated approaches to narrative analysis and fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis, which I've kind of fallen in love with. I'm trying to learn how to do it. But I think we have a lot to learn from entrepreneurship research. And we have a tendency in IE to look at the I side of things without enough E. And this is where it's important to remember that we are an intersection. All of those things are important. Finally, just some quick words on publishing. Speaking from the perspective of JBV and GIBS, you need to know your literature in international business, in international entrepreneurship, and in entrepreneurship. And if you are informing from marketing or finance or wherever, then do that. I've learned that it's really helpful to have cross-disciplinary teams so that we're bringing in multiple lenses. It's like these glasses right now. I've actually got 3 different gradients in here so that I can see different things. It's like that. I have 3 different, I have 3 different lenses when I'm working with a team of a couple of other scholars. Methodologically, I would like to see, and this is me as an editor speaking, more high quality primary data where you've actually gone out there and spoken to informants somehow, some way. I would encourage people to take greater care with secondary data because the proxies can be too far from what you're trying to test. And I know there's a lot of qualitative researchers out there, and I would really encourage you to get better at doing qualitative research and how you report it. And there's a paper by Catherine Welch et al. In GIBS 2020 about theorizing from cases. Kathy Eisenhardt has a new paper out in strategic orientation that she explicitly talks about what she does with the Eisenhardt method. So that could be interesting to you. And Michael Pratt wrote a number of papers, 2 papers that I'm interested in a few years ago, 2008, 2009, in organizational research methods and also in AMJ. And he's talking specifically about how to fit your square peg into a round hole if you're doing qualitative research and trying to get it into a certain type of journal. Very informative. I'd like to see more research in IE in the context of large organizations. And with, again, Shameen Prashantham in the audience, he's written the book on Gorillas Can Dance. I think that's the title. And it's talking about his long-term history and his insights around small firm and large firm collaboration and partnering. And this is also, related to this issue of studying it in the context of large organizations, not just smaller and younger ones. We can also look at older organizations. Comparative studies. I love comparative studies. Long-term data. Cross-sectional data is getting increasingly more difficult to publish. And as I mentioned earlier, support for phenomenon-based research. You see something that's going on. How do I explain this? That's useful. What's less interesting, and I'll say this very generally because it really depends on the paper that comes in, research on capabilities, EO, MO, IO, the strategic postures of an organization, and research on networks, which is funny because I'm a classic network researcher, but we have a lot of research in those areas. Simple managerial characteristics, looking at managers' age, experience, education, that's not enough anymore. GEM data, I think it's past its sell-by date. That's my personal opinion. And simply taking an idea and moving it into a new context, like Ghana or the Philippines, or, it's just because it's a new country is not quite sufficient. And citation analyses and bibliometric analyses. There are, I think, in international entrepreneurship, over 40 of those, which is a huge number. And I think we could probably be a little bit more refined in accepting what we publish when it comes to those kinds of papers. I'm actually going to leave it there, although I want to say, no, I'm going to leave it there. And then I'm just going to skip a few minutes. Except to say, I want to point out the difference between a Born Global and an international new venture. They are not the same. A Born Global is a type of international new venture, and even Cavus, Gill, and Knight say that the term BG is less accurate than an INV. There are different types of INV, and many firms are not truly global. And that's why we talk about born regional firms, for example, or even just born international. They may not be fully global, but they're not just regional either. So it depends on the geographic scope of the activities. So I strongly encourage you to be careful about saying BG/INV. Drives me nuts. If you're talking about a Born Global, and now with digital technologies, now we actually have the chance to see truly Born Globals. But for the most part, firms are probably a type of international new venture. And with that, I wanted to highlight something that's happening here in July, and it is an extended faculty development program in international entrepreneurship. Here in Waterloo, you're looking at pictures of the business school where I'm sitting right now. That's the top picture, and then a picture of Waterloo down below. This is a 3.5-day event immediately after Academy of International Business, where I will be leading it with Manuel. We will be talking to a number, 7 different digital international entrepreneur companies, digital tech companies, ranging from a unicorn down to ones that are smaller. We're going to be visiting some local tech companies here. Google Canada is one, and Communitech is another, which is our big hub for facilitating entrepreneurship in the community. And I would encourage you to join us. So if you're interested in checking it out, please check out that bit.ly. And we look forward to seeing you here after being in Miami. You can come up to the relative coolness, because it will be a bit cooler, but not cold, in Waterloo in July. Thank you.
Nicole, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. For questions, please post your questions on the chat box. Nicole, we have a question here about, what are the international entrepreneurship issues that are additional to the SME internationalization issues?
Are additional. Okay, yeah. So in an SME internationalization, of course, you could be studying small firms with an entrepreneurial lens, looking, for example, at entrepreneurial behavior or understanding how, opportunity recognition, bringing in entrepreneurial theory to inform what's happening in the context of those small firms. A lot of my research is about small firms. But that's my type of firm that I'm studying. It's not my theoretical contribution per se. So I look at firm size as an organizational type, whereas if I'm looking at an IE paper, it would encompass entrepreneurship theory and it would encompass international business theory, if that helps.
Thank
And
you.
I just saw Alex Real, hello Alex, make a comment about strategic contributions to IE should also be highly regarded. I completely agree. And that goes back to the history of Tricia and Ben, because they brought a strong strategy lens onto it.
And Nicole, regarding the definition of, Tricia and Ben Oviatt of international entrepreneurship, a colleague here asked the question, what do you think of that definition? And again, how it was revised later in the context of what's going on,
The
today.
2000 definition?
2005.
Or the 2005, yeah.
Definition.
So the 2005 is a reflection of 2000. Their model is not a model of entrepreneurial internationalization. Be careful with that. Their model is a model of internationalization speed, and they are explicit intent. They wanted to build in networks and knowledge intent or knowledge as a moderating factor, and then internationalization speed. So it's not meant to be a model for the field or a definition of the field.
Thank you. What about entrepreneurial ecosystems and indigenous entrepreneurship? Are these acceptable as part of IE research?
Such a good question. Yes, and particularly when we see ecosystem, for example, how ecosystems compare across, I'll just use Singapore and Canada as an example, and how the approach to supporting entrepreneurial firms may differ across those two. That would be an example of type B of the criteria that we used. When it comes to Indigenous entrepreneurship, one of the things I've always been interested in, so speaking as a Canadian, and I'm also a New Zealander, as I look at our First Nations Indigenous entrepreneurs here and also in New Zealand with the Maori, and their efforts to preserve and then also exploit their cultural, their history through entrepreneurship. I think that has scope for sure for either looking, but it's an issue of either, I mean, I could see one example is comparing what the Maori and the Haida tribes in Canada are doing and comparing them, or looking at what the Canadian First Nations are doing to internationalize their language, their culture, their clothing, their art, those kinds of things. So yes.
Thank you. In regards to publishing, what are some of the common reasons for rejecting, IE papers that are, theoretical or methodological considerations?
Okay, so I'll speak from both the GIBS and the JBV perspective. GIBS, you need to be contributing somehow to international business insight and theory. JBV, you need to be pushing entrepreneurship theory forward or international entrepreneurship theory forward. So each journal obviously has its own bias in terms of its home, IB or ENT. But it's opening up its doors to say, for example, at JBV, I will look at an IE submission, and if it's too much about internationalization and hasn't really addressed the entrepreneurship side of things and isn't kind of, maybe, let's say, hypothetically, challenging the definition of international entrepreneurship, then that's not an IE paper for that journal. So this issue of being at the intersection is important, and recognizing that you need to be informed by both IB and entrepreneurship at a minimum. Most of my work has IB and entrepreneurship. Sometimes it has marketing. Sometimes I have colleagues that bring in a psychology perspective. But IB and E are absolutely central. Then, of course, there's the quality of the execution as well.
Thank you. There's a lot of work being done now in the area of sustainability. What about IE and sustainability? Where are the opportunities there?
Yeah, it's if you're thinking sustainability in terms of environmental and eco type of sustainability, I'd have to think about that a little bit more. Haven't seen a lot, unless again, it would be looking at maybe ecosystems, sustainable entrepreneurial ecosystems across different institutional influences and how they are able to make a difference or not. But I don't see a lot yet. I haven't seen a lot of sustainability and IE research. On the other hand, if you're thinking sustainable means that a firm actually survives over time, that's another way to look at sustainability. That's where the post-entry behaviors and speed come into play to understand what makes, for example, a startup sustainable over time.
And I think we're seeing a lot more, at least in practitioner-oriented publications, work on circularity, a circular economy and sustainability, and the role that entrepreneurial ventures, both domestic and global, play in this particular emerging space. There was a question of clarification to the question earlier. What's the distinction between ecosystems and networks in IB?
Well, ecosystems, and for some people, is a sexy new word for networks. And an ecosystem can be, so a network, let's go back to that. A network can be very organic in that it develops on its own, or it can be very orchestrated in that it's structured with intent. I think most of the ecosystem research and perspectives tends to take the latter point of view, as that you're setting up an ecosystem involving certain types of organizations that will facilitate either a startup to stay up, or a startup to internationalize, or to support international activities. So for example, the cyber ecosystem didn't just happen overnight, and it wasn't super organic. I think it was probably orchestrated and planned. So that's my general perspective on it. I haven't yet done ecosystem research per se, and my research has been between firms specifically dealing with their suppliers and buyers.
There are a number of questions related to technology and international entrepreneurship. This question here about the role of big data analytics capability, and IE, but maybe we can address this question in a general way. How does digital globalization drive international entrepreneurship, and in turn, how does international entrepreneurship again help shape these technologies?
Yeah, it's two things there. One is that if I look at firms that are heavily enabled by digital technologies, or they are operating with a fully digital business model, they almost all have AI or machine learning capability as central to the organization. And so that is influencing their ability just to be smarter companies in the first place. And I think has the potential to help with internationalization. It's not always used for the purposes of facilitating decision-making about internationalization, but I think the potential is there. And I'll use Shopify as an example. The nature of their technology is that it's always collecting data from its users all over the world. And you can walk into the Shopify location offices here in town, and they have a very large television screen that has a digital map on it. And every time there's a new customer, a light lights up, and it's just going nuts all the time. And they decided to harness that finally and look at all of the information that they've been, without intending to collect, had been collecting for years. This is where their big data and their analytics came into play to figure out how to help them strategically manage their international markets rather than just happenstance. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to say was we've learned that with digital technologies is that the expertise for international entrepreneurship is all over the world. We've got a company here in Canada called Van Hack, and their job is to bring in people from all over the world who want to work in Canadian tech firms. And the intent there is to bring in diversified talent from around the world that ultimately makes them, in this case right now, they're helping entrepreneurs from Ukraine and tech specialists from Ukraine come to Canada. And so we are bringing in refugee entrepreneurs, and then those people will be involved with internationalizing organization. So, you know, their skill set is really international. If you're working in the tech space, it's not as restricted by cultural and institutional logics as the previous way of doing business.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. And just to add to the announcement, earlier, what's so unique about our upcoming International Entrepreneurship Workshop in Waterloo is both of our centers, focus a great deal on technology and international entrepreneurship and innovation. So it should be very interesting, to address that. It's as you pointed out in your future opportunities for research. This, I think, is a very, very promising, area.
Well, and as I say, we're having a series of lunch chats and also a big panel where we're bringing in the people who are responsible for internationalizing their tech companies. And yeah, so it should be fun to learn from them. And this is where this interaction with what practitioners are doing is, and the challenges that they're facing is really important.
Great. Nicole, thank you very much. I would like to leave some time for our host at GSU to, do some closing remarks and also make some announcements. But before I do that, I want to thank you again for the, excellent presentation. There's a lot there that we can learn as we do international entrepreneurship research. And next week, we're going to focus on the teaching side of things. So if your schedule permits, we would like to invite you. And there's going to be a heavy emphasis on digital globalization, focusing specifically on e-commerce as a route to market and looking at blockchain and other technologies that impact international entrepreneurship. Yeah. Professor Liu and Pinar, Paula.
Thank you, Manuel, and the CU Denver cyber team for coordinating and moderating this fabulous session. And thank you, Nicole, for this masterclass on IE research. I think everyone have learned so much from it. And I want to thank everyone for joining us from all over the world. Please respond to our survey as you exit. That will give us feedback and ideas for future webinar topics. We'll see you next week on teaching international entrepreneurship, like Manuel mentioned. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye for now.